Okay, so welcome, Lauren Beach. I am so excited to have you here. Can you start out by just telling us a little bit about who you are? How did you become an expert on bisexuality? What are some of the things that you've done related to bisexual advocacy? What are you doing now? So just tell us your life story.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of your course, Dr. Tanya Israel. It's a true pleasure and honor to be speaking with you today. As you said, my name's Lauren, and I use she and they pronouns, just for the record. And how did I get to be a bisexual expert? I think the answer to that question is going to have to be on several levels. First of all, I've identified as bisexual since I was 14 years old. So I have what I would call lived experience, expertise through identity and, being a bisexual person every single day of my life. So you get a lot of experience that way. The second way that I approach engaging with bisexuality, you mentioned a little bit ago, which is through the advocacy route. At this point, I've been on the board of directors of Bisexual Organizing Project. I helped start an organization in Nashville called Bi Plus Tennessee. I started an organization with, again, with other people. You never do this alone. It's all a community effort. Worked on bisexual advocacy work around health policy and health research in Chicago. This is the flag you're seeing behind me right now. This is the logo for the Chicago Bisexual Health Task Force, which has been running since 2018. And I've done work, I was on BINET's board for a while. I've done partnership work with the Bisexual Resource Center on Bi Health Month and other similar educational and advocacy focused campaigns. And also that's the advocacy lens. And then the last way that I approach bisexual knowledge is as a researcher of bisexuality in the academic context. So those are the three ways that I really engage with, I guess, bisexuality as an expert of sorts.
It's so great, like all of these things that you do. And I feel like you just move around the country and everywhere you go, you like create a new organization. I mean, you co-create, I understand, but still it's pretty significant, the things that you have, the things that happen to pop up wherever you live in this world.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's a passion and I can't not do it. I think your outfit also speaks to the fact that this is a big thing in your life too. And teaching a course, like I'm so excited for this content to go on YouTube. I thank you so much for doing this. It's so needed. And I would say the last piece academically, I'm a faculty member at Northwestern in the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing. That's the only last thing I would add there. And I was inspired by people like yourself, including you, to go into this field as a researcher because you paved the way and realized that through examples like yours and Dr. Brian Dodge, Dr. Wendy Doxwick, and many others, that it's possible to have this focus in the academy now. And I just never, it wasn't my initial path. I have a PhD in genetics and a law degree, so I did not think I would be a public health researcher doing bisexual health research and LGBTQ health research writ large. But really it is you, Wendy, Brian, and others who have helped make this a possibility. So thank you so much for being you.
Well, thank you for being you. And I love all the things that you bring to it. So I know you have multiple disciplines that you're bringing to this. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about, how do you use those as lenses to understand bisexuality, to do advocacy and research?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I just wrote a paper about this that got published in the Journal of Bisexuality. My friend Casey Xavier Hall and myself put out this conceptual model called the bias forest model. And it synthesizes lived experience, expertise, community advocacy, and stakeholder status and research knowledge together. The thought is that together that these three different types of ways of knowing can help contribute to an evidence base that could be used to shape policy and education interventions to improve bisexual health. And so I think that that article talks a lot about the different hats that you have to wear and how to think across the different roles and ways that you relate to the work. So so that you can be very conscious of relationship to power and privilege, both in terms of the identities you hold, like in terms of race and gender and class and education and identities in other ways, as well as relationships to the context you're in. If you're in a community context and you pull the researcher hat, that's a power play. And you've got to be very conscious of that people's voices and their expertise isn't drowned out by saying, but science says so. Okay. Like, what about people's experiences vary and community knowledge, I think pushes science forward actually in many ways. And so that we really tried to unpack some of those topics in that paper, because I think it's key to have a model so that you can have the integrity that you would like to have ethically as you go about these change efforts in the world.
Absolutely. And I'm so excited. I haven't read it yet. I'm going to go read it. I'm going to make it available to my students because I want them to have that perspective. You know, when I reached out to you about doing this, I was like, there are so many things that you could talk about. What am I going to, ask you to talk about? And I realized, like, I don't think that they can be separated out. I don't think we can separate out community collaboration and policy and minority stress and health in the way you see it, because they're really all knit together.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much agree with that.
Oh, fabulous. Well, then maybe I'll ask about it in terms of sort of project wise or something. And you can talk about all the things that came to it, because I'm really interested in the policy work that you've done and how you came to that and how you brought things together, and maybe some of the key insights that you've gained from that in terms of, what are the structural barriers for bisexual people, and what kinds of policy solutions do you think we should be talking about?
Thank you so much for this question. It's really been on my mind a lot, especially with the transition administrations politically. Now that we have President Joe Biden in office, I think there's a new set of opportunities to address policy nationally at the state level. I think all across the board, new opportunities have reemerged that we had been thinking about previously under President Obama's administration. And I want to give a shout out to Heron Greensmith and to Dr. Hirokati, who were two really key partners in the policy work under President Obama's administration that led to the 2015 White House meeting on bisexuality and health policy. And I just learned so much from both of them by working with them, and people with the Bisexual Leadership Roundtable and the whole White House Meeting Committee. Like I've learned a lot of what frames my responses has come from those experiences and leaders. But to get to a simple answer to this question, I feel that I felt stuck for a long time as a bisexual activist, because there was a critique that always came up, which was, don't you think that bisexual policy is solved by gay and lesbian policy? And I felt for a long time it was hard for me to answer that question. But we really started to write out the answers in 2015 when we developed the policy briefs that eventually also contributed to Heron's writing of the Invisible Majority report published by the Movement Advancement Project. And what we found is that there are ways that bisexual policies need to differ in terms of policy advocacy from gay and lesbian policies. And specifically, that there are things, if you thought about it, that would be obvious, but it's just hard to identify in the face of someone telling you there's nothing different. Which is also part of that's what biphobia looks like, right? Is that you're just gay light, or that you're just confused, or that you don't, there's a lot of speaks to it, but your own work has detailed that. But what I would say is that we found that employment discrimination can look different the way it shows up in the workplace for bisexual people. Discrimination in the context for a bisexual employee might look like, I just think that you might be a little bit immature. You might need some time. Are you sure? You seem a little confused. Maybe you need to take a step back, because, these types of comments will come up when the employer realizes that perhaps you were in a relationship with a person of one gender, and then they find out that you've been in a relationship with a person of another gender. Those types of immature and confused comments suddenly come up in a way that, okay.
No, go ahead, finish.
That don't seem to for monosexual people. So
And
that's
do those comments come up just around relationships, or is it related to, somebody's career path and their work and all of that?
I think it can be once the idea comes up, people will start to apply it in a lot of different contexts. Well, you can't make up your mind. Look, you were in this career path before, and now you're in this career path, and I feel like you wanted to work in business, and now you want to work in data. Is this? They'll start to attribute these differences that are really also common across people of all sexual orientations. How many careers do people have? Like jumping around from different areas these days. It's a lot of people have these experiences, but bisexual people can be discriminated against for that. It comes in a whole new light once their sexual orientation has been found out or come to light. So also there's bisexual linked sexual harassment that can occur. People sexual harassment occurring on the basis of sexual orientation and not only on gender identity or gender. And that is a real issue across the board as well. And sexual harassment there, sexual harassment, of course, is never acceptable, but I feel that it comes, I have not seen papers on this, but I've seen some qualitative findings that have led me to believe the intensity or the underlying reason for the sexual harassment that occur against bisexual people is directly tied to their sexual orientation. So, yeah.
Wow, those are great examples. I already did talk to Heron, so we had one of these conversations also, and so there's you all and Herukuti have just done so much amazing work on this, and so obviously, like policy, the workplace is one area. Are there other things that stand out to you that you think are useful for people to think about?
Yeah, I think health and healthcare, and that's the area I work in now as my main focus. And so obviously there are many different types of disparities that bisexual people are impacted by that I believe are driven by biphobia. And so we see higher rates of mental health conditions, we see higher rates of diabetes, we see higher rates of isolation and lower levels of social support. We see fewer bisexual people coming out to their healthcare providers, which makes it harder to receive tailored treatment if the doctor knew more about who they were. We see also barriers to access to care impacting bisexual people. Fewer bisexual people have health insurance than people of other sexual orientations, and those numbers are exacerbated, especially for bisexual people of color and bisexual people who are transgender or who are identify as women across the board. And then there are other conditions too, like poverty. We've seen some reports come out from the Williams Institute finding higher levels of poverty impacting bisexual people. And all of those things come together to require, I think, a unique and focused response in the policy arena to address barriers to care, to address social determinants of health, and to address you need to create interventions that are tailored and that work for bisexual people in the context of their lives, and think about how that varies across intersections of identity experience. And that their policy response, though, has not differentiated in the healthcare and health policy arena bisexual people from other sexual and gender minority people. And I think increasingly we're seeing that needs to change, because for some other populations, like we look at gay populations, we're seeing some improvements in health disparities over time. And those same gains don't appear to be impacting bisexual people across the board in the same ways. And perhaps that's because the healthcare infrastructure and health research institutes that are out there aren't thinking in the context of bisexual people's lives and experiences, or the structural levels of stigma like biphobia and how that affects people's resources and care experiences. So I think we really do need to see a shift towards these tailored responses. That was something that was explored in the 2019 NIH meeting on bisexual health research, the first ever government, NIH-sponsored meeting on bisexual health, didn't take place till 2019. And it's available on YouTube. You can watch it on even now. So, but I feel that what we haven't seen from that is any sort of summary or documentation about next steps. Where are the requests for proposals? Where are the program announcements? Where is the notice of special interest that comes out to follow up on that bisexual health research meeting at NIH? It's nowhere to be found.
Yeah.
So you really do, and the only way to change that is community action. You can't separate these things. We need action from researchers of bisexuality, and we need action from community stakeholders and bisexual people themselves to push for federal policy changes, for federal funding allocations, to advance these issues and to say, we're here, we are by, and that matters. We need a tailored response. And we're the majority. I mean, that's something I'm sure has come up earlier. But, the latest Gallup poll data that came out, something like 11% of Gen Z, if not higher, identifying as bisexual. How much more of a wake-up call do you need to have before you realize that we need something specific to be done?
Oh, that is a beautiful overview of some of the really key areas. And I'm hearing a couple things. I'm hearing that we need funding, and we need funding for research so that we can inform policy. And I'm hearing that employment policy needs to make sure that it's addressing sexual orientation and the sort of particular ways that bisexual people experience discrimination. One of the things you're talking about in healthcare and health disparities is biphobia. And so what do you do about that from a policy perspective? You can't legislate people's attitudes, but how do you deal with things on a policy level when that's so much of what's undergirding the disparities?
Yeah, thank you for that really important question. One thing that's obviously in the news right now is the Equality Act, and having that passed. And the question that I have is, where are bisexual people at the congressional hearing table? Because if these stories of what discrimination in the workplace looks like for bisexual people were part of the congressional record that was entered during the testimony for passing the Equality Act, then when lawyers go on to have lawsuits that are seeking to protect people who have experienced employment discrimination under the Equality Act, it'll be clear that the Act covers bisexual people's experiences of discrimination too, because it will actually be in the legislative record that it was the congressional intent to prevent this kind of discrimination under the Equality Act. And without those stories, it's not impossible for the law to protect bisexual people when litigated. It just is a lot less clear how and if it does. So, I think that is a legislative advocacy solution of literally who is at the table that matters. And I think the other thing is that it does is tell bisexual people the conduct I have experienced is unacceptable, because a lot of times bisexual people won't see themselves in the stories in the media, won't hear stories of discrimination like theirs being taken up in court cases. And so they will think that what's happening to them is somehow normal or not, it is okay, but it's not okay. So I feel like that's one thing that we can do on the policy front. On the health and healthcare research front, I just think we need more studies, and I'm trying to do some studies in this area. I have a pilot right now with Dr. Corey Bloom at Howard Brown Health, and that we also are working with the Bisexual Queer Alliance Chicago. Jesse Miller is the president of BQAT currently, who we're working closely together with to identify barriers and facilitators of bisexual plus people's access to primary care and engagement in primary care services. So it's a grant totally focused on bisexual health and bi plus health writ large. And I don't know of that many grants like that. we need a dedicated focus. We really do, because a lot of the studies don't report bisexual outcomes differently. They don't consider sexual orientation as a factor in studies of health related to sexual orientation somehow when it comes to bisexual people, which makes no sense. But biphobia, of course, is the reason why. So people wouldn't think to look for differences in that way. And so they just report general results. They may not include bisexual people in their studies and healthcare and health studies. If they do, they're probably underrepresented, because we should be over half of the people enrolled in studies that are sexual and gender minority health studies and healthcare research. But that's usually not the case. Sometimes it's 7%, 10% maybe.
Yeah.
And we just need a different focus, and we need direct attention and RFAs and program announcements and notices of special interest from NIH would help. Statements from the Biden administration and executive order, or even just a simple statement without it being as official would be a great start. And that requires bisexual people being at the policy tables, in the health advocacy circles, the national LGBTQ advocacy circles. There's a large collection of LGBTQ advocacy organizations around the country that have advocacy arms. They have administrative policy attorneys, governmental affairs officers. But then you have to ask, okay, so where among these is the representation of bisexual health issues and bisexual policy? And the answer is nowhere. Mm-hmm. Sometimes bisexual people are at the table, but I don't know of a single organization that has a dedicated focus, a dedicated person on staff that really puts and centers in place bisexual health policy issues when they go to these legislative advocacy and administrative and governmental affairs advocacy tables. So we really have a gap there. And I know that Erin Grainsmith, I know a variety of other people who happen to identify as bi and have expertise in these areas try to show up at those tables, but it's not a full-time job. And so we really need to fill that vacuum to get people who have that expertise and that focus at the tables, at the decision-making tables, the policy tables. Mm-hmm. And we're really not there in a full-time way right now.
And I'm hearing then that the advocacy organizations that sort of should be advocating for us and for bisexual community aren't necessarily, like the LGBT organizations aren't necessarily advocating for the specific needs of bisexual people.
That is not my impression.
Mm-hmm.
No. Mm-hmm.
Mm. Okay, so that's something that we really need too. So we need the government to do things, and we need our advocacy organizations to really do things too. I want you to talk a little bit more about your research, because I think you are an amazing researcher. And so I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, like, what are some of the things that you found in your research that you feel like are particularly important as people are thinking about bisexual health?
Yeah. Well, my big area of focus currently is on chronic physical health conditions and thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity, health equity issues at the intersections of race, ethnicity, ability, and socioeconomic status. And then I also do that through a lens of geography increasingly. So that's like a nutshell of my focus. The conditions that I tend to look at now are HIV, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. And so I think an important thing that a lot of people don't know, perhaps, is the association between depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions and chronic physical health conditions. And so I think that, especially as people get older, is really important for health in ways that's often underappreciated. And a few years back, I had published a paper with Gilbert Gonzalez, who's at Vanderbilt, and it showed that gay and bisexual men were more likely, they had a higher odds of having diabetes than heterosexual men. And that was true even after adjusting for a variety of factors, that social determinants of health, demographics, et cetera. And there have been other studies that haven't found those associations, but a lot have, especially for bisexual men. And then also the work of, oh my goodness, I can picture her face, not her name. Oh, I think it is Dr. Heather Corliss, found that lesbian and bisexual women in the Nurses' Health Study were more likely to have diabetes than heterosexual women. And so I think thinking broadly for health is important. Also, some of my other studies are more pilot-based. We're looking at who do bisexual people identify as a primary care provider? How does that, a lot of people talk about their mental health provider being more important to them than any other provider they may have ever had. So thinking about how could we use mental health providers as a touch point to refer out to other healthcare providers to build safe networks for patients who want to engage in the healthcare system and find providers who understand them and treat them with dignity and respect they deserve.
Yeah.
And integrating then thinking about sexual health care, screening for their blood glucose, looking at blood pressure, looking at activity levels. Also, we need to fight back against weight stigma in healthcare. That has come up a lot in our the studies that we've done for bisexual health. So I just think overall a holistic approach to healthcare that would connect providers who are already, perhaps maybe there's a safe provider someone has identified. How can we branch out from that to build an effective healthcare network that's going to be across all domains of health? And I think that is going to be, because biphobia and monosexism uniquely impact the health of bisexual people. I think we need to create referral networks that reflect that too, that a provider who is inclusive of gay and lesbian people may not be inclusive of bisexual and transgender people. And we need to make sure that that our referral networks reflect that, as well as reflect the ability of people from different racial ethnic backgrounds to experience care safely. So especially Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are bisexual need to be able to access safe referral networks as well. And I think those are big problems that we haven't solved yet, certainly not nationally, but that we're thinking of developing interventions moving forward to address how do we have better health care, and does better health care, especially it takes into account social determinants, result in better population health? Those are some of my questions.
Fantastic. And I love that you're thinking about health broadly, because I feel like historically, any research on bisexual health has been about men and HIV and other, sexual health risks. And
Yeah,
obviously, like people have more than just sexual health risks, and the fact that you're tying chronic health conditions also to mental health, I think, is really key. So thank you for doing that work. It's amazing.
thank you.
Yeah,
It,
you're really moving things forward.
mm, it makes me feel so good because it's also you telling me this, and I've been inspired by you. So thank you. Yeah.
I feel like there's the people who I have met who are doing work on bisexuality, I have learned so much from and gained so much from. And so we talked a little bit. You mentioned that the White House bisexual community policy briefing. That was a tremendous experience for me, because it was really one of my first connections into this whole national network of bisexual advocates and researchers and activists. And I know, I feel like you have been involved in that network longer than I have. And so I just want to thank you for sort of laying groundwork for all of that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that gathering and what that was and what the goals were and how it came about.
Yeah, absolutely. The White House gatherings had a history that started, I would say, in 2009, when Robin Oakes found out that there was a pride celebration that was going to take place in the White House, and there were no bisexual people invited. And that led to a phone call and a flurry of communications with the White House LGBTQ liaison. And then Robin got invited and she went. But then that, of course, was the first year. And then Robin connected in with, there were a number of leaders at BiNet USA and at Bisexual Resource Center. And then also I, at that point, would have been chairperson of Bisexual Organizing Project, which is the Minneapolis 501c3 organization for the Bi+ communities. And we started talking, and we formed this organization called the Bisexual Leadership Roundtable. There were people from a variety of organizations all over the country who became part of that, basically an email list. And from there, it really was, I would say, Faith and Ellen were at the helm of that for a number of years. And I was at some of the I went to the leadership calls and would be on regular communication. Like, it was powerful to have the leaders of bisexual organizations around the country. At that time, I think there were 5 or 6 501c3 organizations that were dedicated to bisexual communities. Denise Penn from the American Institute of Bisexuality was also part of those calls. And Denise really is community minded. AIB is largely a research institute, but Denise was a very important community touch point as well for AIB for us at that time. And that all paved the way to then have a list of people who could be drawn from to identify folks to go to the White House. So from there, every year we got more and more and more invites to go to the Pride, reception. And I think I went in 2011, just 10 years ago. My goodness. And from there, once we started to be regularly invited, there was a push that happened that was really led by Faith and Ellen to communicate with the liaison, again, at the White House for the LGBTQ communities. We had set up meetings at Creating Change and at other conferences to connect with people from funders from LGBTQ issues and the White House liaison and other folks, just trying to crack the door, if you will, to build the relationships that we needed to have in place to be able to be at the table. And that relationship building went on for a number of years until in 2013, we had the first bisexual White House meeting with 30 people. So that was something that then paved the way for the 2015 policy briefing. We had a year in between where we didn't have a White House event, but we were still in touch with the BOR, if you will. And then in 2015, it was Faith really took the lead. And then Faith had asked me and Heron and Dr. Herc if we could if we could draft some policy briefs, because the idea was that we could have for the first time ever a policy focus. So, but when we got to the 2015 meeting, there were 100 people there. And there was an express focus that we would need at least 50% people of color and 25% transgender people who would be in attendance at that policy briefing, because representation is key and it matters. So we had working groups that were for each brief that occurred. We had experts we were in touch with off the BLR and other bisexual lists that informed the shaping of the content of the briefs. We also reached out to people within Health and Human Services and the federal government to inform on the federal side of what was going on, for, what are the priorities of the administration, where are openings to actually address points of active work, where can we influence policy. And so we had conversations, it must have been 40 or 50 interviews that we did to inform the drafting of those briefs that were presented. I also forgot, and in 2013, that meeting was a little bit different. It was like a fishbowl of sorts. We had bisexual leaders and federal government leaders who were sitting at a table together, and then people from other LGBTQ organizations around the country and organizations focused on HIV, they were sitting around the periphery of our big table. So they weren't at the table, but we were. And that was a very powerful representation. And we had a series of 5-minute presentations on the topics that would eventually get turned into the policy briefs at that 2013 meeting. So the one that I did was with Dr. Hirokati. It was focused on HIV. And so we had put together this short slide set and gave a talk there. And Faith and Ellen did a Bi 101 that was a little bit longer. There were other topics, data advocacy and health and employment and immigration and other topics that were very briefly touched on. And I just think it built bit by bit through these building alliances among and across the different BI+ community organizations, centering in racial equity and transgender equity into that process. And it was, eventually we culminated in the 2016 White House briefing before the election of the president, in between our current and we had the first ever government, I won't call it televised, but it was like live streamed event. The first LGBT live streamed event the federal government ever had was the 2016 Bisexual White House convening. So that is a piece of history that I think a lot of people wouldn't know, that it's an important part of LGBTQ history that's also bi history. So it's I know I gave you a long answer, but how did we get there? It was a long road and it
Yeah.
required years of working together, um, and developing resources, developing expertise, and through conversations with people who identified as bi, community leaders, and then people who are researchers and people in the government who are doing LGBTQ policy work or health work or employment discrimination work or immigration work, what have you.
Mm.
So, yeah.
That's a fabulous answer. I feel like your description of what that history is and that process is so important because you're bringing in all those different pieces of, the research and the stories and the advocacy and the collaboration and how important all of that was to move this forward to get the attention of and the support of the federal government to be able to convene this kind of thing. I mean, I had been doing community-based LGBT work, but I had not been doing bi-specific work. And I did the TEDx talk on bisexuality, and I sort of figured that's how I got in. Uh,
Yeah.
and I came into this really not knowing anybody who was there, and it was an amazing and transformational experience for me. I mean, I came back and I started a bisexual discussion group in my community, and I got connected with all of y'all, and so just so much appreciation for you and everyone who had put in so much work up to that point, and continuing to just get that in place. Really tremendous appreciation to you.
Well, and thank you as well for, I think that I think you are the highest ranking bisexual person I know in academia as a
Oh.
department. Like I think so. And if there's a ripple effect, like the papers that you published, I cited in developing White House briefing materials.
Mm.
So, I think there's a lot of ways that we have supported each other that may not even be visible, but that really matter for the progress that's been made.
Mm. That's
Yeah.
so great. Ah, thank you. And we're recording this in March, which is Bisexual Health Awareness Month, which I think is great. Is there anything you want to say about Bisexual Health Awareness Month or this? Yeah.
Yeah, it's been incredible. It's been so important. And it's led by the Bisexual Resource Center. And they've had a point person who has run this, I think it's in its 7th or 8th year. And it's really gaining traction nationally. People proactively reaching out to ask how can they support and engage in Bi Health Month. And one of the other exciting things about this year is there's a project that we launched in September of 2020 called the Visibility Impact Fund. And I know you know about it. Yes, thank you for your support.
Yeah.
And the Visibility Impact Fund this year, we just put on our website today announcing our grantees, our first ever round of grantees. And we intentionally announced that during Bi Health Month because we really wanted people to be able to have support to do health related programming in Bi Health Month. And we are really proud of the selections out there. We have supported 3 different organizations. So I think that, Bi Health Month has inspired that movement. And then it's the very first that I know of anyway, bisexual grassroots funding organization that's ever happened. So we had 3 $500 grants this cycle. And in September, I think we're going to be announcing our second granting cycle, or it will be the fall. For granting in September is ideally what we're trying to do to, again, boost the capacity and visibility of bisexual programming for Bi Week in that case. So we're just trying to make all these connections, lift up the work of the important work of organizations out there and supporting new organizations to build capacity for bisexual health and visibility. So
I am just moved to hear about that. One of the things that I really want my students to understand is how you can actually make a difference. Like, what can you do that will create a resource, that will create an infrastructure, that will create support? And I feel like everything that you do, has a real direct impact. And so just thank you for kind of bringing all of your skills and expertise and many different hats and many different disciplines to just advancing the interests and rights of bisexual people.
Oh, thank you. This is important too, because the Visibility Impact Fund is important because it gives us a seat at the table at Funders for LGBTQ Issues, which is I guess it's the number one organization I know of that really keeps track of LGBTQ philanthropy, both nationally and internationally. And having a seat at the table there as a funder is really important for being able to have the ability to influence conversations about LGBTQ philanthropy. What does it look like? How are people talking about it across these hundreds of organizations out there that are doing community-based grant making to address, the human rights and health and other focus, employment, et cetera, all the things we've been talking about for LGBTQ people. And up until now, we've never been a peer, and now suddenly here we are.
So great. That's so perfect. Is there anything else you want to make sure you say? Anything else that you would want to make sure people know?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to write about more in the near future is the landscape of bisexual community organizations. Specifically looking at, I had done a study that I never published in 2014 and 2015. I went through the IRS database and was looking to identify all of the 501c3 organizations across the United States that are specifically focused on bisexual people. And I was convinced I probably knew them all, but wasn't sure until I did it, the search. And so I think it's important to be aware of the community landscape and the resourcing of bisexual community organizations, and to know the difference between LGBTQ organizations writ large and bisexual specific community focused organizations. And there's a big difference between those two, as you spoke to. I went through that same transition. I was a bisexual identified LGBT activist who didn't transition into bisexual focused activism until I had like this awakening, kind of like we talked about, that I had mistaken biphobia for allyship in LGBT movement building previously. And once I realized that error, I quickly corrected my focus. But I would say, so right now, there's still Bisexual, the American Institute of Bisexuality, Bisexual Organizing Project, PAVES, which is out in Colorado. There's BQAC, which is the Bisexual Queer Alliance, Chicago. There's the Bisexual Resource Center. And I feel like I know there's an organization in Arizona that's trying to get 501c3 status. And there's then there was an organization out in Oregon or Seattle, or Oregon or Washington State, excuse me, that used to have 501c3 status, but that fell away in the 90s. That was bi-specific. And of course, there's BiNet USA, which was subject to some controversy last year. But it still technically exists as an organization. But those are the organizations I'm aware of that are 501c3 organizations that focus on bisexual communities. And any organization not listed there, I don't think has that focus currently.
Wow. So, that's remarkable. That you can just name them all, that's how few there are.
Yeah, there are others like by Tennessee or by Plus Tennessee, but they don't have 501c3 status. They are a nonprofit that was incorporated in the state of Tennessee, but they don't have that status. And that's important because having 501c3 status makes it possible to, first of all, receive grants from foundations. And second of all, it makes it easier to collect donations from individual donors. Now, you can still receive donations from donors without 501c3 status, but it is a little trickier. And then a lot of foundations won't grant at all unless you have 501c3 status, or if you have to have a fiscal sponsor. So that's the situation of Visibility Impact Fund. We are fiscally sponsored now by Social Good Fund as of, I think, 2 weeks ago. And then I think there's other organizations out there who may have fiscal sponsors that have a BIPOC focus, but those are harder to track on the IRS site a bit. So, but I just want to highlight who those organizations are. And if you're somebody who wants to know who do I partner with, that's the list. If you want to know how do I engage in understanding like what is the capacity of BIPOC movements, like that, looking into the resourcing and the capacity and the volunteer networks of those organizations, I think will help give you that answer if that's something you're interested in, something I want to look at more in depth. But I just think the other thing I will say in closing is that bisexual community organizations have a long history of doing a lot with a little, but let's hope that our new trajectory moving forward is expanding capacity and expanding growth so that we can uplift and make visible at a larger and larger scale the beautiful talent and life-giving change that can come from these organizations can be present throughout more and more society. So
absolutely. Wow, that is beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lauren Beach. You are a fantastic light and hard worker and creator of community and research and advocacy. So thank you. It's been just such a pleasure and honor to get to talk to you.
likewise, and I love your outfit. I'm going to say it on the record too. It's just, you are such a joy, Tanya Israel, and best of luck with the class. And thank you again for everything that you have also done for bisexual communities and advocacy and research.
Thank you.